Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the author interaction, which concludes this segment of the NLF Reading Challenge 2021. My name is Karthika. I'm the head of reading at Neev Academy. We're very excited to be here, and we hope you are too. The NLF Reading Challenge is a 6-month-long reading event from January to June 2021 for students between 10 to 13 years of age. It is open to participants on the competitive or the non-competitive tracks. We have students from across India participating in the challenge. In addition to fun book-based activities and regular author interactions, the challenge will conclude with a quiz competition that will see the 3 best teams win gold, silver, and bronze engraved trophies respectively, certificates of achievement, and a great set of books. Incidentally, the quiz is set to take place at 5 p.m. tomorrow. Before we dive into the interaction, we would just like to point out to our audience that as this is a webinar, we will not be able to respond if you raise your virtual hand. Please use the Q&A box to type out your questions. In fact, if you already have your questions ready, please feel free to type them out. If you're a student, a teacher, or a school librarian, please do mention the name of your school along with your question as well. We're sure you're all eager to get started with the session. Before we do, we just want to acknowledge that our country hasn't completely recovered from the health crisis yet. However, we are getting there slowly and steadily. We hope that these sessions have been a small breather for everybody who is watching and will continue to help provoke deeper thought on the books that we've been reading. Today we have with us the critically acclaimed writer, Anthony McGowan. Anthony John McGowan is an English author of books for children, teenagers, and adults. He is the winner of the 2020 Philip Carnegie Medal for Lark. In addition to his 2020 win, he's been twice longlisted for The Knife That Killed Me in 2008 and Brock in 2014, and once shortlisted for Rook in 2018 for the same honor, the Philip Carnegie Medal. Anthony is also the winner of the 2006 Book Trust Teenage Prize for his book, Henry Tumor. His most recent book is I Am the Minotaur. Welcome, Tony. We are very happy to have you with us today.
Hello, sorry, I was muted like a novice to the world of Zoom when I've been doing it so much. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, and we
can you hear me? Oh, brilliant. Yeah, I'm so sorry about messing up the technology already in the first 5 seconds, but I'm so delighted to be here with you today.
Thank you so much. Before we start off, we have a bunch of questions for you, and we also have questions coming in from the audience. So those in the audience, if you'd like to ask Anthony your questions, please do post them in the Q&A box. We'll get started in the meantime. We have to also warn our audience that our questions for the session are quite lengthy, so thank you in advance for your patience. All right, Tony. I want to start by asking you about the reason that you wrote Lark and the Truth of Things Quartet, which has the books Brock, Rook, Pike, and concludes with Lark. You've talked about the fact that you got the idea for the book because you had the idea of a younger brother who's a carer for an older brother. You also wanted to represent the lives of the people in your town, the small town where you grew up, because ordinary lives can be filled with as much drama and danger and tension and excitement as possible. In Lark, Kenny is a boy with special needs, and Barrington Stoke, your publisher, brings out books for children with learning difficulties and for reluctant readers. Did you decide to pitch it to Barrington Stoke because of Kenny's character? How, and could you tell us a little bit about how Mari Kidd, who was the former MD of Barrington Stoke, badgered and baited the book Brock, and with it, the Truth of Things Quartet into existence?
Yeah, sure. It actually has to go back a step further. So the very first book I wrote for Barrington Stoke was a book called The Fall, which is, I suppose, set in the same universe as the later books. But it's a very, very dark and depressing story. It's a story about an adult man who's haunted by some errors, some bad things he did when he was a teenager himself. And it consists of his recollections of those. And it kind of spirals increasingly down and never emerges back into the light. And I always felt kind of guilty about it. So I wanted to write some books that had in some ways a similar feel, that kind of realism, but also that poetic intensity, but which lifted my characters a little bit further into the light with each book. And also I've been very interested for a long time in the lives of young carers in the UK, where there's really a frightening number of teenagers are responsible for either older siblings or younger siblings or even their parents. And it's instantly, I think that as a reader, you're on the side of someone who's in that role, someone who's a child, but also got these responsibilities. And I began to think about this relationship between the two brothers, which is very intense and entwined and loving, but also complex. And so it grew out of that, really. And so the first book, The Fall, I think that Barrington Stoke liked it a lot because it's a little bit different to most of their other titles. It was in some ways more literary, a little bit more ambitious, even though it ended in that dark place. So they were keen to really have any ideas it wasn't a battle at all with my publisher. Pretty much whatever I come up with that they were keen on. And Mary Kidd, who was the MD, also my editor there, was my biggest supporter. That, as a writer, you need somebody like that who gives you love, editorial love. But she was also quite stern, because I should perhaps explain a bit more about Barrington Stoke, that their target audience originally was young people with dyslexia. Then that was widened to young people who just don't read for whatever reason, reluctant readers. And so there were particular requirements that they wanted from their texts. So you had to pare down your language a little. The books also are in this very attractive font and with thick paper, so they're easy to read. And so there was a slight learning curve with my first book for them, because my style before that was very ornate. It wasn't for reluctant readers at all. It was complex and convoluted and very showy-offy. And so writing for them, I had to pare it back and think about what the reader really wants, which is character that they love, a setting that feels real, and a plot that grips you. And so writing for them, I think, even though it involved stripping away some of the things which made me, I think it made me a better version of me. So that was a very long answer to your question.
No, we love long answers. They go perfectly well with all our long questions. So Tony, taking off from that thread, where you've talked about how there's a version of you in your writing, you've talked about how you really need to hear the voice of your characters in your head. You really need to know your characters as you write, especially if it's a YA book. And in Lark, when Nicky starts to remember pictures from encyclopedias that he's read, I was reminded of the fact that you read a lot of encyclopedias when you were a child, and a lot of books on wildlife. You also grew up in a household with 4 siblings, in the McGowan household. So how much of you and your relationship with your siblings finds its way in Nicky and in the banter between Nicky and Kenny?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And it seems that I ought to have been drawing on my own background, but almost for the first time ever, I wasn't particularly with those, because my own family background was very different to theirs. My family was, not rich at all. There were 5 children, so both of my parents were nurses. So money was an issue, but it was a very loving household. As a household full of energy and noise and combat and fights and makings up after that. So it's not at all like so. And my character wasn't like Nicky's really at all. Was in some of my earlier books, the main, I nearly always use a first person narrator for my teenage books and younger. But in the early books, the first person narrator is basically me, a cleverer, funnier version of me. But with Nicky, I deliberately pulled myself out of my world and imagine myself into his, which is a much more constricted, dark world. Just for the sake of your listeners, so they're in this small town in the north of England, which is my town. So that bit I borrowed, but their family life is much more difficult. So Kenny, the older brother, has learning difficulties. And partly because of that, his mother left home when the children were quite young, and their father's tried to do his best, but he's fallen apart too. So he drinks too much. He can't cope, and so the 2 boys are more or less left to fend for themselves in this almost feral existence they have. They haven't got enough to eat. they're dirty, they're smelly. So that's the place at the beginning of the series, and they gradually, with each book, their situation improves and their lives get better. So I genuinely did have to try and imagine myself into those characters, and they were partly based on people that I knew growing up, both in the small town where I live, but also in Leeds, a bigger city in the north of England where I went to school. So it's more a case of reaching out and trying to imagine myself into their lives. But on the kind of first point you made was that I always need to get that voice to begin with. Well, I mean, that's for a very good reason. That I'm an old man. I'm 56 years old. I'm not a teenage boy, but I have to find a voice that works for my teenage readers. And for me, that always means getting back, doing this kind of archaeology with my own memories and going back into being a teenage boy again. And if I have a teenage narrator, then automatically I think I'll have a voice that works for my teenage readers, ideally. Even though my teenage years were back in the 1970s, so before you were born, I guess, Karthika.
Yes, but the fact that you're managing to stay relevant and stay readable, I mean, that's testament to the power of your writing, isn't it?
Well, but it's been pointed out by some of my teenage readers that in almost all of my books, there are no mobile phones. Because when I was a teenager, they hadn't been invented. So I always have to have a reason why my main character doesn't have a phone. Either the batteries run out or they just can't afford it. But also, mobile phones ruin plots. There's all kinds of things happening in my books so in one of my earlier books, a book called The Knife That Killed Me, another kind of dark book, is a crucial moment when the main character, he arranges a date with a girl at the cinema and she doesn't turn up. And back when I was a teenager, it's very hard to get hold of people. But now you just dial their number. Well, where are you? Oh, we're there in 10 minutes. It's all sorted. So the plot dies. So for those, that's why I'm quite glad to take mobile phones out of my stories.
Fair enough. So taking on that subject of creating spaces in your stories for your readers to think about the plot, I was struck by a pivotal moment in the book Lark, when Nicky's past and present selves collide, where he's lying down and he thinks he can feel the hay of the field near the wood where the badgers lived. And he goes on to say, and I love this, so I'm going to read this out from the book. He goes on to say, and then I heard the sound, the mad, ecstatic music of the lark. I peered into the brightness and saw the small bird straining upwards, its flight not like the easy, carefree swooping of the swallows and swifts. The lark's flight was all effort, as if hauling itself up by sheer will, a wanting, a yearning. To fly and to sing was work, it was grit, and it was beautiful. I realized that in this passage, not only does it speak about the moment when Nicky finds himself in, but also sort of it's a crossover when Nicky's sort of moving on from crossing over from the pain that he's experienced all along. He's letting go of the weight of responsibility that he's experienced, of having to take care of Kenny, of having to deal with their mother leaving, of keeping the household together when his father was an alcoholic. There's that. It's also a moment when the book's past and present selves collide, because you have a reference to Brock and the badgers so beautifully woven in there. Not only this, but I was wondering if the flight of the lark, could it serve as a metaphor for your journey as a writer? You've written over 50 books so far. You've said that you took a long time to get the narrative lines right for Rook, which is the third book in the series. And you said for Lark, you wrote it within a month, as if you were a writer possessed. That could possibly be your finest work yet. Were these factors alive in your mind as you wrote?
Well, that's such a brilliant question, and thank you for reading it so beautifully as well. Just when you were reading and talking now, I was kind of struck by something that that often as a writer, you maybe don't have a full understanding of your own work, and often it's that what the meaning of the work emerges in that relationship between the writer and the text, and also the reader and the text. And you brought out some things there which maybe they were almost conscious but not quite conscious in my own mind there. I'd forgotten about the linking back to Brock, but I almost don't know how to answer the question. But on the kind of last little bit about how easy it was to write, I suppose that what I found historically is that there's not necessarily a connection between how difficult something is to write and how easy and the quality. Sometimes the work you have to sweat blood over is terrible. Sometimes it's really good. Sometimes the stuff that comes out really easily is terrible. Sometimes it's really good. But I suppose with Lark, it just instantly had that feeling of rightness. As you know, I'm a slightly obsessive, albeit not very gifted cricket player. And when you play cricket, and if you're a batsman and you hit a shot, sometimes it kind of squirts away off the edge, and it might go for 4 or it might go for nothing. But sometimes you just time it beautifully, and it feels right, and you get a little thrum of pleasure that goes all the way up the bat, up your arm, and into the small of your back. That sense of rightness from that shot, and it might go to the fielder. You might not even get a run for it, but it still feels right. And Lark felt like that. It felt like a well-timed shot in cricket. But I suppose also by that stage, I'd known these characters for a long time through 4 books over several years, and they were so that the voice was so internal to me now that so a lot of that effort you do as a writer is thinking of the characters and thinking of the world. That was already a given. I knew all that. So all I had to do was get the words right. And I think for once they came out right. But I should ask you, so the book is based around this metaphor of the skylark, the lark. In India, do you have skylarks, the same species? I know there are many different species of lark, but I think it's called the field lark sometimes.
I don't know, but I will look it up because my knowledge of birds is very limited. But I will be sure to look it up. If there's anybody in our audience who knows about whether we have skylarks,
I'm intrigued.
Please do type out a message on the Q&A box, and we'd be happy to read it.
But they have this particularly specific way of singing. So most birds will sing on a bush or in a tree, but skylarks literally they start on the ground, it's open ground, and they fly up singing, and the song continues until they disappear. And it is a completely magical thing to behold. Yeah,
it sounds fascinating, and magical is a good word to describe it. We have 2 interesting questions, Tony, from 2 members of our audience. Tasmia from Parikrama Jayanagar, who asks, how did you think about the title? And I'm sure a lot of what you said now would be in response to her question of how did you think about the title, Lark? There's another question, Anaya Kanchan from Neev Academy, who says, what inspired you to write a story that was gritty and different and life-changing in the period of a day?
I missed the second part of the second question. Inspired me to write a story that was
gritty and different, life-changing in the period of one day.
Okay. So the first question was about the titles. Well, the very first title in the series is called Brock. And brock is an old word for a badger. It's kind of disappeared, really. Most people wouldn't know what a brock was. But that story was, again, partly inspired by, there's a famous English nature writer called Henry Williamson, who wrote, his most famous book is called Tarka the Otter. But in the same collection that he writes, Tarka the Otter, there's a story called Brock the Badger, which is about an old male badger. And my book begins with an old male badger about to have his last fight. So Brock, I borrowed that word for the title. But then I thought it was quite a good title because it's short and it's got a good sound. So I wanted then for this next book to have a similar sound. So the next book in the series is called Pike, which is a kind of large carnivorous fish. So again, with that that aggressive k sound in one syllable. And then after that, Rook, which is a kind of like a crow, a rook. And then finally, Lark, which again has got the k sound. So it was all triggered by that very first book, Brock, and then trying to find other words that kind of worked. But it was, I suppose, each time there was a weird mutual support pact between the title and the book. So they kind of emerged together. So on the second question about why did I want to write a gritty, realistic text? I don't have any strong views about genre and the kind of books that young people should read. I think young people should read whatever they want to read. I'm delighted for them to read fantasy or science fiction. But I suppose I partly perceived that there was maybe a shortage of books that had that realism, that gritty realism, that felt true. And so I wanted to kind of slightly readdress the balance. An awful lot of the most popular teenage books in the UK are fantasy. Not just the Harry Potter books, but the all these different fantasy series. So I wanted something that felt real and true, but also, as you said right at the beginning, I do genuinely feel that what we call ordinary life of ordinary people is in fact filled with the stuff of fiction, of conflict and love and hate and rage and challenges and triumph and disaster. So I wanted to focus on that, to show how ordinary life is not ordinary at all. Yeah, I suppose also, historically there's been quite a big middle class bias in English, British in particular, writing for children and teenagers. I suppose more children. And again, I wanted to address that balance, to have working class or poor characters and show that they're just as interesting as the middle class characters. But I'm not saying that any of those other genres or areas or books aren't worthy and worthwhile. But I just wanted to add an extra something into that mix.
Thanks so much, Tony. We have one of our readers who's in the audience, Arushi Chandra, who says, answering Mr. Anthony's question, most skylarks are not found in India, but the Eurasian skylark is found in India. It's found in almost all of Asia, the whole of Europe, and the northern states of Africa. Thank you, Arushi, for that.
Thank you very much.
Tony, I just want to sort of latch on to what you said about how young people should be able to read whatever they want, and which is true. I heartily agree. And I'm sure there are librarians in the audience who agree with that as well. You speak your readers' truth in your books. You reproduce dialogue, you voice thoughts as your characters would, without censoring, and you have scatological humor. There's mild expletives included. I'm guessing that when you read at schools or when you read in sessions where there are grown-ups in the audience, there may be the occasional pursed lip or sour expression. Does winning the Carnegie Medal help validate your beliefs about the language that your characters use in your books?
Oh, again, it's another very good question. But I suppose whenever I read sections from my book at events, I suppose I perhaps tend to pick the ones that don't have the very, very strong language. But I mean, I did first encounter this problem, if it is a problem, back with my second book for young people, which is a book called Henry Tumor, which is about a boy who's got a brain tumor which talks to him. The brain tumor becomes a character. It's based on Shakespeare's play Henry IV, Part 1, and the brain tumor is meant to be Falstaff, this kind of larger than life, foul-mouthed, drunken but intelligent kind of person, and the tumor's like that, and the tumor's language is often very strong. But when my main character first finds out he's got a brain tumor, he uses some very, very strong language himself. He uses the F word, and this is going back to 2006. And that was being very controversial. I had to fight to get that F word in there because it just seemed to me that it was appropriate at that moment in your life. If you find out you've got a thing that may well kill you, you're not just going to say, oh, flip, or oh, blast. You're going to use a strong word. So whenever I use strong language in my books, I hope it's always appropriate. It's the kind of words that would be used in those situations. And also, when you're writing for teenagers, it's got to have that sense that it's real, that it's like their lives. And I'm afraid that perhaps Indian teenagers are much more polite and well-spoken. I suspect they probably are, but British teenagers use strong language. So it was an element of trying to be realistic. But I suppose that because I've tried internally in the text to justify those controversial elements, I've not actually received too much pushback against it. I'd actually forgotten that at the beginning of I did a school event this morning. I read the beginning of Lark, and I'd forgotten that there was a rude joke at the beginning of Lark, and I slightly started to blush when I knew it was coming up. I kind of ploughed on with it, but after that, so the beginning of Lark is kind of dialogue between Nikki and Kenny, and they're using teenage language and teenage jokes. After that, it becomes more, I suppose, more poetic and more intense. That first bit is kind of silly, joking around the way that teenage boys do. Have I answered your question there? Have I just waffled around it?
No, you answered it very well. Thank you. So Tony, we have a question coming in from a member of the audience, which I'd like to sort of weave in with my next question for you. On the subject of keeping it real and depicting characters from across different situations. You've talked about how your schooling at Corpus Christi School in Leeds, it was a tough place to be. And there was a moment of epiphany in your class when your classmate David Tordoff recognized himself and kids like himself in A Kestrel for a Knave by Barry Hines while he was reading aloud. And that sort of has inspired you to depict the lives of children like David Todor in your books. We met Emily Drabble from Book Trust, and she did a session with Shayoni Basu, who's one of India's best children's book editors, where she spoke about a north-south divide in children's literature in the UK. And she's talked about how it's not, the northern dialects are not represented enough, and northern stories are not represented enough in children's books. Do you feel the same way? Do you feel there are writers who are doing this now and who are doing a good job with it? And the question for you from the member of the audience is Lavanya Karthik, who says, were The Knife That Killed Me and Hello Darkness inspired in any way by your own experience of school?
Oh, okay. Wow. So yes, on the first question about that north-south divide, I don't know. I've been to India a couple of times, but I'm guessing that there are some regions of India which are looked down on in some way by other parts of India. Would that be inaccurate? And
the
I suppose that
divisions are quite real. Yeah. Class.
Okay. But one of the complexities of kind of England and Britain is that as soon as you open your mouth, you betray two things. You betray your geographical location, north or south or east or west, and also your class. So you're instantly judged the second you open your mouth. And yes, historically, I suppose publishing has been based in London. Many writers are based in London, as to my shame am I now. And the north often would be neglected, particularly working class voices from the north. So I did want to address that. I mean, there's been occasional times in the 60s, there was a little flourishing of northern working class literature, more for adults, but occasionally it flowers and then it withers again. So I did want to give voice to those communities in the north, especially the small town where originally it was in an area that was a kind of mixture of agriculture and mining, lots of coal mines around there. And so all the coal mines over the past 30 years have all closed. So in some ways, these are communities that are dying, that they've lost their reason to exist. And there's a kind of desperate sadness about a lot of these northern communities. And that's kind of almost their background world of that having lost that solid place in the world. And I did want to give voice to those characters who are, I think, neglected. But you're asking about, I was trying to think about other writers for young people who have northern settings. Actually, the best one is a friend of mine. I've got one of his books here. It's just come out. Where's it? Ah, yes, here we go. He's a guy called Phil Earle, who's a brilliant writer. His latest just came out last week. It's called When the Sky Falls. It's set in the Second World War. But he's written a series of books again about working class people. I mean, we're from different northern cities. Mine's Leeds. He's from Hull, which another northern kind of city. So Phil Earle is a brilliant writer for young people. But again, so on that point, one of the ways in which publishing has definitely improved over the past 10 years is by understanding that diversity is a key here. That young readers need to recognise themselves in the characters. And so it's much more culturally and ethnically diverse now. So there are many great Black writers and Asian writers. I'm not saying everything's okay, but it's much better. And lots of new upcoming writers are not taken from that kind of London white dead male elite world. So that's great. But still, my perception was that a lot of those new diverse writers were still kind of from the south of England, and also not infrequently middle class. So in some ways, the class element is the one part of diversity that's not been nurtured, not been brought through. So again, I focus on that.
Thanks so much, Tony. So we are at the close of our session. We have one last question. We are going to overrun by 5 minutes. I'm just telling the audience this. If you could have a shelf of books, Tony, that have helped make you who you are today, through childhood, through growing up, through adulthood, what would the titles on this shelf be? This is a question that we ask.
Yeah, how many books am I allowed? I'll try and be. I was actually going through looking some of my old books, but back when I was a young child, as you said, I was obsessed with facts. I was obsessed with facts about war. I liked airplanes and tanks and and ships and that kind of thing, but also facts about the natural world. And my absolute Bible when I was growing up was this book, which I got from my local library over and over again, but I bought a copy on the internet. It's called the Guinness Book of Animal Facts and Feats. And it's basically a huge compendium of often grotesque and terrifying facts about the natural world, about the man-eating tigers and man-eating leopards and piranha fish and different forms of parasites and monstrous things. And I reckon that still about a third of what is in my head came from the Guinness Book of Animal Facts and Feats. When I've spoken about this many times. So I read mainly fact books when I was a small child. And then when I was 9, a school teacher gave me The Lord of the Rings to read. And I didn't know what this thing was. I didn't know what a novel was. I hadn't read all of the books, the fiction books that children usually read back in those days, Enid Blyton and Roald Dahl. I just hadn't read them. And so I had to learn how to read fiction by reading The Lord of the Rings, which was a very challenging text for a 9-year-old. And it probably took me 3 years to read it. But then I read it over and over again. And in that process, I became both the kind of person who reads fiction and also perhaps the kind of person who one day might read it. I've just got a very beautiful edition of the Lord of the Rings here, which it's not the same one that my teacher gave me all those years ago. So that was very important. Then when I began to write and I was trying to find my voice, I wasn't sure what kind of writer I was. And I had a very boring job working for the government back in the 90s, early 90s, as a civil servant. Everyone's kind of nightmare job of being like a bureaucrat with a big pile of files, and it's really boring and difficult. But I used to read my way through a lot of classic text on my journey into work. And one of the books I came across was a book called Gargantua and Pantagruel by Rabelais, who's a French monk writing, I think, in the early 1500s. So it doesn't sound very promising, but Gargantua and Pantagruel is this grotesque comic narrative filled with philosophical debates and religious parody, but also full of this most disgusting humor, this body comedy. I mean, I don't even want to shock you by telling you what kind of things are in it, but lavatory humor. So it's that combination of lavatory humor and philosophy. And I kind of realized, oh my gosh, that's me. That's what I want to do. So although it's if you've just read the Truth of Things quartet, there's some rude elements, but my other books do have this more explicit combination of toilet humor and also philosophy. So that was Gargantua and Pantagruel was very important to me. And finally, I got very much into an American writer called Cormac McCarthy, who's a brilliant, intense, dark, poetic writer of tragedies, really. And so I was reading him when I wrote The Knife That Killed Me, which is my attempt at being more Cormac McCarthy. So it's dark, intense, doom-laden poetry. So one of your, and then your question, that your listener's question was about, was The Knife That Killed Me and Hello Darkness based on my, well, the Knife That Killed Me was very much, the school in The Knife That Killed Me was my old school, Corpus Christi High School, where there was lots of bullying, lots of fighting, lots of violence, lots of fear. But what there wasn't back then was knives. So, and what I found out was I couldn't find a single case of where a teenager had beaten another teenager to death. It doesn't happen. It's too much like hard work. You know how lazy we were as teenagers. But if you introduce knives into that situation, then suddenly death haunts it. And so in the year I wrote it, there were 40, I think, teenagers stabbed to death in London by other teenagers. So what it was, The Knife That Killed Me is me putting knives into that old school of mine and seeing what would happen. It's about a very ordinary kid who gets mixed up in that world of gangs and knives. And it's a kind of doom-laden tragedy, partly based on Cormac McCarthy, also partly based on the Iliad, Homer's Iliad. It's a kind of retelling of that. Hello Darkness is a different kind of story. It's probably might be almost my favorite book. It's a story set in a school where they have school pets, school animals. I don't know if that's a thing in India, but the school animals are being murdered one by one. And the narrator is called Johnny. He's always around when the school animals are being murdered. So he gets the blame. So he's got to try and find out who's really killing the school pets. So it's a kind of pastiche of a detective story, like a film noir. But you find out about halfway through that, in fact, Johnny's stopped taking his medication. And so he's actually got paranoid schizophrenia. And his and his world's increasingly strange and mad, and even the school building kind of warps, and the school's full of these gangs that are a bit like real school gangs, but not really. And so it's a kind of story that becomes a story about madness, and that was not so much based on my school experience, but on, I suppose, members of my family who've suffered from mental illnesses. So it was using that experience, then putting that in a school context. Again, another long, waffly answer to your brilliant questions.
Thank you so much, Tony. We really appreciate that you gave us the long answers. We love all of those. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this with us today. This has been an absolute pleasure.
It's been my pleasure. And thank you so much for reading my book so carefully and coming up with such brilliant questions. And thanks also to your listeners and watchers for interacting as well. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone who has joined us today. We will have the grand finale quiz of the NLF Reading Challenge tomorrow at 5 p.m. IST. Please do join us. It promises to be fueled by bookish excitement. We will put up all our details on our social media handles. Please do follow us there for any further updates. Until then, stay safe, take care, happy reading.